Welcome, everyone. So nice to see you all. I'm here today with Aiden Gray Smith, who is sort of like our first trial run guest. We are interviewing people beyond Lit Mag editors, and I'm so excited to have Aiden here today. Hi, Aiden. How are you?
Hello, I'm good. Thanks so much for having me.
Good, good. So Aiden, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us where you teach and a little bit about the program that you teach, particularly at Emerson?
Sure, yeah. So I've been teaching writing at the college level for about 19 years now. And I teach first year writing at Quincy College, but I teach creative writing and literature at Emerson College. So I'm affiliated faculty there in the Department of Writing, Literature, and Publishing. So the students coming in there, in my classes primarily want to major in creative writing. I do get in some of my classes, I do get students from other, like video, media arts, things like that. But a lot of them want to be writers, and I teach introduction and I also teach intermediate. So, they're at all different stages in what they can do creatively and what they know about publishing and sort of the writing world. And yeah, I'm also a working author myself. I also write under the name Amy L. Clark. So I have a couple books out. And I'm a reader for a literary magazine called Fractured Lit as well.
Oh yeah, great. Okay. Fractured Lit is flash fiction.
Yes, Flash and Micro, yeah.
Awesome, awesome. So is the program at Emerson something that you designed, the curriculum, I should say, is that something that you designed, or is it sort of like a curriculum that you inherited from other professors? Because I know they have like a very strong writing and publishing program. So I'm curious if that's something that you, like the particular thing that you're teaching, is that something you set up or did you sort of inherit it?
Yeah, I mean, sort of a mix of both. There are certain things in the program, there are certain like learning outcomes that we have to hit. And so I can get students to those learning outcomes however I want, for the most part, but there are certain things that like there are skills that they're supposed to leave the class with, and I'm supposed to assess those skills. And that's true in the lit class, which is an interesting lit class because it's called the art of fiction. And so instead of being sort of a traditional literary analysis class, we look at literature specifically through a craft perspective. So, I tell those students at the beginning, I'm like not that interested in like the themes and the symbolism and like whatever. I'm interested in pulling these stories apart to see how they were built. And so, yeah, so for both that and the creative writing classes, most of the assignments that I design are my own, of my own design, although they fit within sort of the standards of the department.
That's great.
Yeah.
Also, I didn't mention at the beginning, but as always, you guys have any questions, go ahead and type them into the chat and I will work them into the conversation. So when students come to you, when they start out, where would you sort of rate their knowledge of literary magazines? Do you have students who've like never heard of a literary magazine, or are they already sort of familiar with what's out there?
I would say it's the whole spectrum, right?
Mm.
I have students who have never heard of a literary magazine. I have occasionally students who have submitted, and even occasionally students who come into my class already having placed things with literary journals. So I do have, I always ask at the beginning of the semester, does anybody have an experience with publishing? And sometimes that, they're like, oh, I was in my high school literary mag. And sometimes they really, they have like a submittable account, and they, I had one student, we were doing I talk about publishing a little bit throughout the semester. And then at the end, I talk about publishing a lot. And I had one student in the middle of that lesson go, oh my God. And I was like, what? And she was like, I just checked my submittable queue and I got something accepted like 3 months ago and didn't know. Like, what do I do? And I was like, oh God. All right. Like a good literary journal too. I
Oh,
was like, first
wow.
of all, congratulations. Secondly, I don't know why they didn't send you an email. And thirdly, like, let's call them. Like,
Right. That's adorable.
it's kind of the full spectrum.
Yeah, yeah. So
Although
that's
it's a,
interesting. Yeah. Is submitting to LitMag something that you encourage? And we'll talk more about this because I know, and this is something you mentioned to me as well, that like a lot of MFA programs they really seem like they have nothing to do with literary magazines. Like they don't encourage submitting. They don't even really talk much about the submitting process. So I'm curious if that's like, do you help them submit? Are you encouraging them to submit? Or would you say to them, wait, perfect your craft, or a little bit of both of those things?
I mean, we definitely talk about sort of perfecting your craft first and foremost, and doing your best work and sending your best work. But no, all of my students in fact are required to submit to a literary journal at the end of the semester. It's the last thing we do on the last day. And I will just say, I saw somebody on Twitter who worked for a literary journal, who's an editor at some literary journal the other day, and I wouldn't say who, but also I literally don't remember. And they were like, for every teacher or professor has your students submit at the end of the semester, like that's an awful lot of work for us. And they're just sending, and I was like, I thought that was terrible. Like
Yeah.
I am a reader for a literary journal, and like that is what we do. We read
Right.
this. My students' work is not, no matter what their background is not necessarily worse than anything else I get in this lunchbox.
Yeah, there's like a weird assumption implicit there, right? That it's like stuff that they wouldn't want to publish.
Yeah. And some of my students are brilliant. So they do, yeah. We
Yeah.
talk a lot about publishing in general, and then on the second to last day, I run them through what I call like everything you need to know about publishing in less than 2 hours. And then on the very last day, we work together as a class to find all different literary journals that might work for different pieces that students have written in the class, because we've all read each other's work. And then each one of them will submit to a literary journal of their choice.
That's really cool. So it must be interesting to sort of see them go through the learning process. Like, can you tell us a bit about some of their discoveries, for better or for worse, like things that surprise them about lit mags?
Yeah. I think the big surprise for them is just the raw statistics, right? When you look at what is the percentage of work submitted to literary journals that is accepted, right? And we talk about different kinds of literary journals, and and we look at different statistics about like, this journal accepts 14%, this journal accepts less than 1%, but I think that they're always really shocked at the odds, just at how hard it is.
Yeah.
And I think too that one of the big surprises for them is how different parts of what we talk about as publishing are really so separate and siloed.
Mm-hmm.
So we talk about sort of like small independent presses and how that's different from like one of the big five, and then how that's different again depending on genre. And they're always really surprised about that.
Can you tell us more about that? Like, what do you mean?
Yeah. So one of the things I talk about in terms of that is like, you can be a writer. I mean, they are writers. We're all writers, right? All you have to do is write. But also like, you can be a published author and have a completely and totally different experience of that world than somebody else who is also a published author.
Yeah.
So I always ask them like, have you heard of Colleen Hoover? Have you heard of Colleen Hoover?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And like, so, but the fascinating thing to me about Colleen Hoover is that, remember they did that big article in the New York Times about her a couple of years ago?
Mm-hmm.
I literally had never heard of her.
Oh, funny.
Like, I just had not, because that's not,
You've never been in an airport?
I don't know. I never picked that up. And I talked to them about it like this. I'm like, this is how disparate this world is. Like,
Right.
I'm a working writer, right? I am not like a rock star writer. I'm not on the New York Times bestseller list. I'm not in sure of doing that anytime soon. But I'm like a good, like, if I were a musician, I'd be like a gig musician, right?
Yeah.
I'm good at my craft. I have the respect of my peers. I get enough gigs that like I'm in the gig. It's very fun. And I was like, but now imagine that you're a gig musician and you've never heard of the Beatles.
Right.
But that's totally possible within this
Right.
world, right? To have these, because the world of publishing means so many different things to so many different people. And so we also talk about like, what is it that you want to get out of being a published author? And there are different paths to that. So I think that's surprising for them.
That is an amazing lesson that I feel like is actually not discussed enough. And it's kind of blowing my mind even to think about right now, because I feel like it's true even for most of us, like working as writers, like we have this idea that we're going to break through. And once we break through, then we'll be like Colleen Hoover or Liane Moriarty, or like, this level of, like the HBO deals come in and whatever. But what you're saying is so interesting and so realistic that you can break through and like you're still working, you're still teaching, you're still hustling, and it's like an ongoing kind of like I like the comparison to a musician who's like doing gigs on weekends, sort of like it's an ongoing process.
Yeah, absolutely. And, like every time you try and get something published, like, and I tell them, if you build up your CV, if you publish a lot, then like that will help you publish more. And still, it's every roll of the dice is independent from the last one,
Mhm.
right? There's no guarantee. It's not a linear path
Right.
to
Right.
achieving any one sort of outcome that you desire. And also that you get to think about, what does success look like for you? What outcome do you desire on an ongoing basis? Like that might
Mhm.
change for you, and that's okay.
So, how much control do you think writers have over where they land in the marketplace, I guess is what we're talking about.
Very little,
Yeah.
very little.
Yeah.
I think, you want to be good at what you do. You want to feel good about what you put out there. That's within your control to a certain extent, to a large extent. And I think if you have the ability, which means money and time, to participate in certain activities, then that will help your chances. Not everybody has that ability, right? And even then, a lot of it is a portion of it is luck, and a lot of it is, who you know and who you are. And some of us have larger barriers to being accepted in that world than others, and that's just a
Yeah.
fact.
And also, would you say writing style too, right? Like if you are writing like Colleen, if you are writing sort of mass market romance stories, then you're gonna land in a certain place in the market. But if you're writing more psychological stuff, you're writing more experimental stuff, it's a different path.
Yes, absolutely. And I think even that, to some extent, is, we think of that as a choice, right? You can choose what genre you write in, and that's true. But I am never going to be a good romance writer. Like, I'm just not. I don't enjoy reading it. I haven't read enough of it to like get all of the genre norms down, and like I don't have enough of a compelling interest in it that even if I sat down and read 100 books, like I am not going to be excellent at that, right? So it kind of is like partially interest, partially work, a lot of luck, and partially just the realities of what I would say is probably a deeply unfair system.
Mhm. Mhm. So do you encourage your students to sort of identify like a path, like a realistic path for them at the outset? I could see how that could be both incredibly liberating, and a part of me is like, God, I wish I had this conversation with someone 15 years ago. And then on the other hand, with young people, like you don't want to put them in a box, creatively, right? And you don't want to say like, okay, you're never going to be on the bestseller list, so just focus on this particular trajectory. So how do you kind of balance that, and do you kind of go over this with them?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is incredibly liberating,
Mhm.
hopefully, in the way that I deliver it, because the message isn't like, you over there, you're going to be on the bestseller list, and you over there, you never are. So like, stop talking to each other. It's fine. The message is more like, you only have a certain amount of control. Control what you can. Don't worry about the rest of it. But also, like, the great news is that once you stop worrying about the rest of it, you get to define success however you want, which is amazingly freeing, or has been for me. And secondly, you get to try out all kinds of stuff. My students, for the most part, at Emerson are like 18 to 22 years old. I'm like, this is the time. Get as weird as possible. this is the place to put out all of your terrible ideas. And actually, the more practice you have putting out all of your terrible ideas, the more innovative you're going to be throughout your whole life and your whole career. You're going to have a lot more fun, and you might come up with something like completely brilliant.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So do you find that their ideas of success change over the course of the term?
It's interesting. I think I've seen more that like over the time that I've been teaching, students come in with, in fact, actually a more realistic idea of success. It used to be that I would sort of give this talk at the end of the semester and everybody would be like shocked that they weren't like about to be on the bestseller list next year when they graduated. And now I think that a lot more of them have a more realistic sense of like sort of what it takes and what are the odds. But you know, even within that, I think like teaching them about how all of this stuff works, I don't know that it changes their goals or what they want. And that's not my aim in doing it. But I think it does let them think about a lot of ways of having a career and also a lot of ways of having a life. Right. You can be the writer who does nothing but like go hard at that. And you might actually have more success than me. You probably will. Or you can be a writer who has a life, and neither one is sort of better, right? But like be aware of your options to a certain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you find that a lot of them are interested in like the MFA sort of academic uh, pipeline, for lack of a better word, or do you? It sounds like, I mean, what I like about what you're saying is that it's like opening up possibilities, and it's sort of telling them like there's so many ways to go about this. Like you don't have to just kind of follow a script.
Yeah. Um, yeah. In terms of them being interested, it's interesting to me because Emerson has what's considered a very good MFA program. I graduated from it myself like a million years ago, and then spent a lot of time very far away from Emerson. But came back and teach undergrads now. And I would say I get a few every year who are interested in MFA programs or who are interested in, getting a PhD in literature. But primarily, I think my students who are creative writing majors, like they're not even interested in that. They just want to like go like write stories and get them published. And I'm like, okay, like there's a bunch of ways of doing that, but
Yeah. So let's talk about that part of it, the writing stories and getting them published, because we have a lot of people here. I'm guessing most people are out of the college phase, and they're trying to get stories, essays, poetry published in lit mags. So how do you take your students through that process? Like, what do you tell them about lit mags? Where do you advise them to begin, and sort of take us through some of that?
Sure. The first thing I do is talk to them a little bit about what it looks like to be a working writer. So we talk about things like how do you stay really organized? We get really practical, right? We talk a lot about finding different lit mags and one that would be right for you. And we say like there's 800 million lit mags, right? And like 4 of them just closed while I was talking, and like 6 more might have been born. I don't know. But there's so many and so much sort of diversity out there. And the good news is that like whatever your deal is, there is somewhere that wants it. Right? You just find it. So we go through, we do a search through, I use Duotrope, which I know you have to pay for, but I started using it back when it was free, and it's a really great way to organize my stuff. So we do a Duotrope search for different literary journals. We use Chill Subs, also to search for different literary journals. And, I have them pull different journals up and we put them on the big screen and we talk through like, what's the deal with this? What do we like about it? Is there anything that's a red flag? What don't we like about it? And who is it a good fit for? So we talk a lot about sort of finding that and looking at those. And then we talk about cover letters, like how to write a good cover letter, what it's for and what it's not for. And because I am a reader for a literary journal, I also am able to take them through my submittable page. I take the names off everything, of course, but I can take them through what it looks like on my end as a reader when I get stuff from like the slush pile and what that process is like. And I'm sure it's different from journal to from, you know, magazine to magazine, but what we do where I am.
Mhm. It's really interesting to hear you say you talk about getting organized. I feel like, oh my God, I wish I had you as a teacher like
Thank
20
you.
years ago. Because I've been, there's a part of me that still operates under this myth of like, the artist is just crazed and messy and organization is for, I mean, hopefully I've learned this, as an adult, I've gotten better with this stuff, but the idea that being organized is really like a requisite for building your career. So you can be, chaotic and disorganized if you want to be a writer, but if you want to actually have a successful career and build it, going back to sort of like the way you were talking about in a realistic way, you do kind of, have to have your shit together. And that's a really important thing for people to understand.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I also think that like, you know, that really is a myth. You can be a writer and be totally chaotic, but as you said, if you want to build your career in a realistic way, you have to be organized. But also, like, don't think that like those people who seem like they came out of nowhere and just got plucked out of the sky because they were so brilliant and didn't have to like, you know, work for it in the same way as the rest of us. Don't think that those people are not like brutally organized, because they
Mhm.
absolutely are. There's a lot going on
Yeah.
behind the scenes with those folks.
Yeah. Yeah. And also I think, is there really anyone that just pops up out of no, like I remember there was this article, I think again, maybe in the New York Times or something, somebody was saying like, oh, Roxane Gay like came from nowhere. And people are just cracking up because people know that Roxane Gay spent a lot of time like in the small press world, in the lit mag world, people don't just like spontaneously pop up out of nowhere. There's a lot of work that kind of builds up to that.
That's absolutely true. Although I do think Roxane Gay is unusual to some degree because she was at she sort of became like a big deal right at this time when there was this sort of change in the advice that people were giving to young writers. You know, one of
Mm,
the things that people used to say actually was like, if you have a novel, if you have a short story collection and it's really good, don't publish with a small press,
mhm,
right? Like, because that'll ruin your chances
mhm,
of getting published by like a big five. So don't skip that. Just go for get an agent and do that. And she was one of the first people I ever saw who had published with a bunch of small presses, a bunch of lit mags, and had a whole collection out that was then later picked up by a big five
mhm,
and republished,
mhm.
which was kind of really interesting. I'm not totally sure how she made that happen, but it's cool.
That is really interesting because I feel like that is still the prevailing advice. Like for your first book, it's almost, this is going to sound really bad, but I mean, it's not what I'm saying, but I feel like that's still, it's an idea that's out there. Like you don't want to waste your debut on a small press. So I don't, it's something that I've heard, but I'm actually quite glad to hear that it could be shifting or the views around that are changing.
Yeah, I definitely have heard that. But I think it's not just Roxane Gay. I can't call them to mind right off the top of my head, but there's a number of people who, you know, not only debuted with small presses and then went on to publish with big fives, if that's what you're interested in doing, but also who had earlier work republished then
Mhm,
to a larger
mhm,
audience. So I think that, you know, I think that advice, you know, don't waste your work on a small press used to be true because there was so much snobbery in the lit world and big five, and that is still 100% true, but that particular aspect of it I do think is really shifting. There is a little bit more awareness
yeah.
in the literary fiction world of the big five that, like, you know, people are doing good work elsewhere.
Yeah, that's really cool. It might also be that writers maybe feel a little bit more empowered themselves, like they don't care. There's not that they sort of view the role of gatekeepers differently, perhaps.
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah. Yeah.
It's interesting. So going back to the lit mags, you mentioned when you pull up the screen of LitMags for your students, there's some red flags that you occasionally identify. Can you talk about those?
Sure. So first we talk about things that are like definitely a scam, right? So for example, if you are trying to get an agent for a larger work, you don't pay a reading fee to the agent. That's a scam. Agents don't require that. And we talk about literary magazines in terms of sort of red flags. We get a little broader than that and just talk in general about like there are some places that are straight up scam, right? And those are places that like want you to pay to have your work read, and then once you get accepted, want you to pay to have it published, and then want to sell you a copy of it back. That's not good. You shouldn't pay to get published. But beyond that, a lot of what we talk about is just, when you are looking for a potential publication for your work, do you want to be in the company of this publication and these authors, right? So one thing I'll say is, I used to do this. I used to go in and be a guest speaker at a class that was like entirely about publication. And the guest speaker right before me was always this dude who's like a friend of mine, but he is the editor of a very good literary magazine. And he would come in and be like, if you're going to submit to a place, you have to buy a copy of their journal and you have to read it cover to cover. And then you have to buy another copy and you have to be really familiar with the whole thing. And I would always go in and be like, thank you so much, friend. And from the perspective of a working writer, don't do that. I don't have that kind of time
Right.
or money. But I will say, while I wouldn't say you have to spend all of your discretionary funds on literary magazines and read everything cover to cover, if you are considering publishing with a place, you do want to read the work on that website or in that journal, because you want to figure out like, are these people that I want to be on the page with, right? If it's all full of terrible typos, yours probably will be too. And is that what you want to put out in the world? Probably not. But also like, look at the kinds of stories or poems that are in there. Is it something, does it make you cringe? Are you like, oh God, no. And is it offensive? Right. I mean, there are all kinds of things out there. So, and is it just a good fit for your style of work? I'm not going to submit to a sci-fi journal. They have no interest in me. Right. So we talk a lot about like all of that stuff. And then we do look at some of the fine print sometimes. We look at things like how, like if you go on for example, on Duotrope, I think Chill Sub says this now too. How long on average does it take for a journal to get back to you? Right. There's some magazines that specialize in like, we do a turnaround in 24 hours. Like, okay, I don't know. But then, there are places that like on average it takes 265 days. Like, that's a lot. Look at maybe why is that happening? And then the percentage of publications that they get and then publish. We look at pay and we look at rights. And I tell my students like, a magazine is going to want to acquire at minimum the first North American rights. That's good. That's okay. They may ask that you not republish it somewhere else for up to 60 days after it is published with them. That's fine. It's like anything beyond that, I don't know. I'm not a lawyer, but I would say don't do that. Rights should revert to you as the author after publication, because ideally you get paid twice for every story. Once in a literary magazine and once when you put out your brilliant collection.
So what do you tell them about tiers? And this is, I think tiers are like more complicated than people realize. And for me, I always tell people like the tier that first of all, what's right for everybody is going to be different. So just because something is like a top tier magazine doesn't mean that it's right for you. And then also like which tier you aim for can change piece by piece. Like sometimes you have a piece that you really do want to hold out for like a top tier magazine, and sometimes you just want to publish something that's going to give you, a quick turnaround time, and it's going to be online and you can share with all your friends, and so your goal may be different depending on the piece. But yeah, I'm wondering how you sort of frame the conversation around lit mag tiers.
Yeah, I love the way that you put that. I mean, I think it depends on the piece and what your goal is. And we talk about looking at some of the very, very top tier stuff, right? If we're talking about like the Paris Review, we're talking about the New Yorker, like you can look at what Duotrope says about the percentage that gets published, but also like what percentage of their stuff is actually solicited.
Mhm.
I don't know. I'm not sure that you can find that out. I suspect it's an awful lot. So we talk about how, the literary world can be very closed and very insular. Do they publish anything from the slush pile? Probably. I don't know, but maybe not. And that's something to take into consideration, that there are other ways to get to that, right? Um, and then we talk about, what is the, again, finding sort of what is the ideal journal for your piece of work. Like, do you have something super weird and experimental? Like, awesome. That you might find like a second tier or even a top tier journal that's like all about that. You might also find a bunch of weird little zines that have like a total cult following, and those might be your people. And
Mhm.
that's really cool, right? And again, stuff like how quickly do you want to hear back? I mean, I tell them, I use my own experience. I'll say like I have one piece that I really love and believe in, and I really think would be a good fit for a really broad audience. My aim is absolutely second tier. It has been rejected 21 times, and I 100% believe that it will be picked up and I will be paid money for it. And then there are pieces that I'm like, I know this will easily get picked up by second tier. And then there are pieces that I'm like, I have no idea, whatever. I'm just going to send it to a whole bunch of weird little places and see what happens. And that's really fun. And sometimes those places are cool. You meet other cool writers through them.
Do you think that a writer has to choose between like this cool indie zine where you find your people and that's, those are your people, and sort of more large scale success? Can you have it all?
I don't know. I mean, I would say that you may end up in one or the other, and there are lots of life circumstances which will make those things mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
I don't think that you have to choose.
Mhm.
I mean, I think if Zadie Smith like sent something to a little literary magazine that has 450 readers in the history of that literary magazine, they might publish it.
Mhm.
But she
Mhm.
might really enjoy those other people that she meets. I don't know. I don't know that you have to choose, but
Yeah.
I think that you do have to think about what are your goals and ambitions, but also how those change, not just piece to piece, but at different times in your life. What are you looking for?
Yeah, and I think, and this is something I think about too a lot, is like finding that balance between contentment and gratitude and appreciating the success that you've achieved and also not being complacent, right? So like you don't want to take for granted, if you cultivate an audience of like 25 people who really, really dig what you're doing, you don't want to take that for granted. But you also, I think it's natural to want to like have a larger audience for your work.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Um, yeah, and I think you can do both of those
Mhm.
things,
Mhm.
right? And I think the one thing that I always tell my students is, um, well, two related things. The first is like, you're not like a real writer the first time you get published. You're a real writer the first time you get rejected. That is the bulk of the game, right?
Right. That's great.
It just is.
Yeah.
But the other thing that I tell them is like, you know, really you have to love the work,
Yeah.
not just the publication. You have to love the work.
Mhm.
Otherwise it's not worth doing.
Yeah.
And beyond that, like when you do have successes, you absolutely have to celebrate them
Mhm.
because it's amazing.
Mhm.
And it is this incredibly rare thing to have any level of success doing that.
Yeah.
So it's like you're a rock star. And the third thing is, no one will ever be as proud of you as you.
Mhm.
Don't expect it.
Mhm.
Like you love what you do and you should love your successes and you should celebrate them beyond what anybody else cares about with your work.
That's great. So we have some questions here. Would love to hear about your experience as a reader, and how your experience as a writer and professor brings to that process.
Sure. Um, yeah, so I love being a reader, and I think it's it's taught me a lot of different things. One of the things that it's taught me is that like it the more sort of invested you can get in a community of writers that you think are like interesting and cool, like the more opportunities will open up to you, but also like the more fun you're going to have. I really love the journal that I read for. Um, and you know, it's also really demystified the process for me, which is what I try and do for my students, you know, to remember that like readers are just all kinds of regular people, right? Like I am not, I don't know, the single authority on good writing, right? And also I'm like a human being, like your piece might get rejected because I was like having a really bad day. And I try not to ever let that happen, but like again, human beings, right? So it's demystified it a lot, but it's also been an amazing experience because um, it just shows like the huge breadth of things that are out there. You know, what you don't get to see when you submit is who else submitted, right? And that is really interesting to be able to see.
Mhm. Yeah, I like the way you phrase that too. Like if you get involved in a community, you're naturally going to find more opportunities open up to you and you're going to have more fun. And I actually kind of prefer that over the concept of like literary citizenship, which sounds very dutiful. And it sounds like, on top of being writers, we all owe something to the community. We have to like do all this community service. But the way that you're framing it just sounds very organic. And, it's good for your career, but it's also like you're just going to have fun and you're going to learn a lot.
Yeah. And I always tell my students, you know, the lit world is unfortunately, in my experience, extremely like clicky and kind of
Mhm.
mean sometimes. And like it doesn't do any good though to like network in the traditional sense. Like I would not, you know, because some of my students are very sort of like business driven. And I'm like, you can try, but writers are just regular, but like very awkward humans. And doesn't work that well. And my big recommendation is like, do not network with any writers that you don't actually want to be friends with.
Mhm.
There's enough of us out there. Like, find the people who, not just whose work you like, but who you actually like,
Mhm.
and you know, show up for them and with them, and then like a lot of opportunities come from that. Go to readings,
Yeah.
right? You know, say yes to things,
Mhm.
and you'll get a lot out of that.
Yeah, absolutely. A question here. I'm interested in what the real practice is of simultaneous submissions. Yes, just get your stuff out there and ask for forgiveness later if something gets picked up by more than one place, or hell no, don't do it.
Oh, absolutely simultaneously submit. I think one of the things that I'm really pleased to see is that there's a lot more recognition among literary magazines that like it's not fair to say no simultaneous submissions. You know, literary journals can't always get back to you really quickly because of the huge volume of submissions that we have, and there's only so many readers. And also, that means that you can't just submit to one place and say, you know, oh, and hope that that'll do it, right? The odds are just not with you in that. So there's not that many people who say no to simultaneous submissions anymore. But if they do, like, screw it. No, absolutely simultaneously submit. What is the worst thing that's going to happen? You're going to get something published, and then you're going to have to go to the other literary journal, not personally, unsubmittable, and just hit the withdraw button. And if they're like, why? Just be like, because. Nobody, nobody knows. I don't have like, you know, I don't know. As far as I know, the literary journal I work for does not have a big blacklist of people who like withdrew, because
Yeah.
why would we keep track of that? It
Yeah,
just,
I completely agree. And I think if there is a lit mag that says no simultaneous submissions, they better be responding in like 24 hours.
oh yeah, yeah. And if it's anything more than 24 hours, then like, no, don't listen to that. Don't all over the place.
But to the question, generally, simultaneous submissions are fine. So yes, you should be just sending out, as many as possible. A question here: how do you recommend writers with no published work write a cover letter? And maybe just to get more specific, I think the bio is the part of the cover letter that would be most questionable. So if someone has never published before, they're brand new, what should they say in their bio?
I love this question. And again, like as someone who reads for literary journals, I will say this. I read the first thing that pops up on my screen is the cover letter. So that is the first thing that I will see if you submit. Um, and I've read some really good ones. I've read some really terrible ones. Even when they're really bad, I try not to let it affect what I think of the work, because like ultimately I don't really care if you're terrible at cover letters, if your work is really good. That said, again, human beings, and some of that will sort of bleed in probably to the way I'm reading your work. So if you have no publications, that is totally fine. I would say, the purpose of the cover letter is to show us that you can write a sentence, that you are probably like legally able to enter into a contract, right? You're not 7 years old or like in voluntarily committed somewhere. And like that's about it. So title of your piece, word count of your piece, and then you can say, if accepted, this would be my first publication. That's a cool thing to say. We might want, like, that's amazing if we are the first person to discover how awesome you are. So just put that. If you want to tell us a little bit about your life, okay, but I would say keep it really, really short. One thing that I don't like is when people uh, who don't have any publications list like 1,000 other accomplishments that have nothing to do with it. I had, sometimes people will say like, when I was an undergrad in 1968, I was on the dean's list, and I'm like, I don't understand. And it sounds a little, I don't know. So I wouldn't do that. But you can, if you have if you're in an MFA program, if you have a background in publishing, if you have written, you've never been published in a literary magazine, but you like have an incredibly successful newsletter, whatever, you can mention that. But it's also totally okay to just say, if accepted, this would be my first publication.
Yeah. I also think it's interesting sometimes if people just say like one line, like I'm a retired nurse, or something that just like tells a little bit. Because I also think among the things that you mentioned that a cover letter does, I also think of cover letters as kind of icebreakers, even though a lot of editors don't even read them at the beginning. They read them closer to if they're accepting a story, then they'll go back and read the cover letter. But that's sort of how I think of them. So just I think it's fine to say like, I was a high school teacher for 30 years. This would be my first publication, something like that. But like you said, just like literally like one line.
Yeah, particularly if it's relevant, but even if it's not, like, yeah, that's great. Keep it short, but like, absolutely. That's
Yeah.
really cool.
And then also, I would say to limit the length, even if you have a list of publications and it's relevant, like even then it gets a little too much. Like not only the dean's list, but if you've been published in like 30 lit mags, you don't have to name all 30.
Pick your favorite three and then say, and many others.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so a question here, I would love to hear a description of the gigging musician writing career. And I too would love to hear that description. I think that sounds great.
So like, what is so yeah, I mean, and again, everybody makes different choices. I've made a lot of maybe non-traditional choices in my life. But like I have a whole life, and I decided that I wanted that. I have a child who's now grown, but I had, partners, I have whatever. And I also was very fortunate, and I tell my students this, like, if you really want to do this way, find something else you love. In addition to writing, and not just as a hobby, but like that you can make money on, or at least have maybe some health insurance. Like I did not want to teach, and got a teaching gig sort of like accidentally when I was 26, and then immediately was like, I love this. I love this as much as I love writing. And I've been very fortunate to be able to have something else in my life that I love, and that, gives real meaning to my life, but also pays the bills. And so yeah, because I do have a very full life. I also have like a lot of hobbies. I teach at two different colleges, and in any given semester, I will teach between 1 and 4 classes. I'm affiliated faculty, so I'm not full time. I was offered a tenure track position a number of years ago and turned it down, because I wanted to have a life and write books. So I teach at two different colleges. Between 1 and 4 courses per semester. I try not to teach the whole summer. I am currently teaching one class right now at Quincy College. But I will have the second, it's like a condensed class. So I'll have the second half of the semester off to just write and work on publishing. I also write, like I said, I'm a reader for a literary journal. And one of the things that we offer is for a small fee, you can get an editorial letter from one of the readers. So I get paid to do that. And I love doing that. And I put a lot of effort into that. I'm going to tell you all about your story and what's working and what you might consider changing or working on. And I write as often as I can. I don't have, I'm not one of those people who's like, I have to write every day or has like a particularly like, I said, be organized, do be organized, but I don't have a very rigid practice. I write when I can. Usually I'll sit down for maybe about 4 hours at a time, depending on the week, between 1 and 4 times during the week. And then I make sure that I always set aside time to submit to literary journals, or depending on the project, presses, agents, whatever. Yeah, and that's kind of my deal. And I guess it's sort of a gig musician model because I didn't choose to make it my whole life, but I publish often enough that I get to teach kind of whatever writing classes I want to. I just have to find the place that wants me to do it, which I think is really fun. And between all of these different things, like I make enough money to have a decent life, not extravagant, and I, have a good time doing it. So
Yeah. So would the gig be like the publications in lit mags, or I feel like there was like a golden age of readings and readings. Maybe I could be totally wrong about this, but it seems like readings don't really happen so much anymore. Things are, I don't know, maybe more things are virtual. I don't know, but so I'm wondering if like the comparable thing to like a gig would be getting published in a lit mag or like a chapbook, or how do you sort of see that?
yeah, I think for me, yeah, and I think you're right. I've never heard anybody say that, but I think you're right. I don't think there are as many readings because
Mhm.
small presses used to like set up lots of readings for you when you published a book.
Mhm.
And now they tend not to do that very much. Or maybe have like one virtual thing or whatever, which is like, okay. But if you can find readings, go to them. That is where the writers hang out.
Mhm.
I met one of my really good friends who's like a very, very successful author by just like, I showed up at a reading and she showed up at it too. And then we went out for drinks and like, awesome. But yeah, so I would say the gig for me is the publications.
Mhm.
So I would consider that, sort of like a gig because I get to do this. I'm doing this thing that I love to do. I'm hanging out, I'm writing. And then, just like practicing in my garage, right? And then like trying out like new weird stuff. And then, when I get published, that's my opportunity to have other people see me do
Mhm.
this cool thing that I love to do. And hopefully to get a little bit of money for it,
Yeah.
right? And it also helps build my CV so that I can teach at more places if I want to, or have more opportunities like that. So that's kind of the gig. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's interesting too, because I think it's like a difference between local success. Like I was actually just thinking about this last night when I was living in Boston. Like there were these local bands that everybody loved, and you'd go to like the Middle East and Tutu the Bears, and like everybody knew these bands. And I think that has kind of faded away too, sadly. But there's a culture around like local music, and like everybody knows these local musicians, and they may be touring, but they're not aiming for like the big record deal. And so that to me also seems like the comparison. It's like you're achieving like a certain kind of like really cool, really gratifying and local success, as opposed to aiming for like the Colleen Hoover, airport paperback level
Right.
success.
And I mean, like if somebody offered me like a, multi-million-dollar deal for my next 3 books, I would absolutely take it, right? As would I think all of those bands that played at TT's, which sadly is closed now.
Yeah, yeah.
terrible. But you know, I think, you know, anybody would take that, but also that that's not explicitly, or not even that that's not explicitly the goal so much as like, that's not, I'm not a failure if I don't do that,
Hmm.
right? That
Yeah.
doesn't, it doesn't diminish my success in any way.
Mhm.
Um, you know, it just means that, yeah. And I think that like analogy to like local success for a band is like, you know, not local in that my geographical community knows my work, but like that there is a community at a
Right.
tier of literary journal where like if you say my name, people know it, which
Hmm.
is fun. And it's funny because people who like have no idea about writing or the lit world at all and like don't care, sometimes you're like, oh my God, you're famous. And I'm like, yeah, like 40 people who are all
Right.
in the same circle. Though if you say my name, they're like, I know that one, right? And I'm like, but also like not, you know, at all. But it's fun, you know, whatever.
Right.
You find where you're
It
at.
is. I mean, it's going back to that idea, which is like defining your own idea of success for yourself, and like who cares? But you, I mean, if this is your thing, then that's gonna make you happy. So great.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
Just, you know, I mean, you can always strive for something more, but
Mhm.
you have to love where you're at.
Right.
Like you
Right.
have to love the work. It's part of loving the
Mhm.
work.
Totally. So a question, I think this is going back to the cover letter thing. What about magazines that ask for awards? I wonder about those publications. Is that, I'm not I think, Fran, do you want to clarify the question, like magazines that ask for a list of awards in the cover letter? I'm not sure.
Um,
Um,
yeah, I mean, I always find that a little off-putting and wonder if they're, you know, really snobby about, I mean, I have a few, I could throw them in, but I don't usually, which is another question. I was raised not to blow your own horn. So all this stuff is very hard for me to do.
mhm.
Uh, and when I see that, I think, am I supposed to write every, like, Aiden mentioned every accomplishment, every, you know, big thing that might be big. I don't even know it's big. I mean, you know,
So these are magazines that like in the submission, they want to know.
yeah.
Oh, okay.
So I would say I have not actually seen that before. That seems a little red flaggy to me. I don't know why anyone would ask for that. And so maybe be suspicious of that journal as you are, rightfully so. But also, you know, I would say, um, you know, if you have awards in the writing world, then like that's okay. That's okay to include. I will say I personally have a thing, like maybe this is, I shouldn't say this is snobby, but I personally have a thing about people saying like they've been nominated for a push cart because like I want to know if you won. I don't actually like, I've been nominated for a push cart, but like I didn't win. So but anyway, so if you have awards like that are related, it's okay to include those. First of all, you should absolutely be proud of yourself and you have got to toot your own horn in the red. You have to. And also, if someone's explicitly asking for a list of awards, I'd be very suspicious.
Yeah. Yeah, I haven't seen that either, except in grant applications, which then I see a lot of that.
Okay.
Yeah. Like fellowships, grants, stuff like that. Which actually is another question. Is that part of the package of what you teach to your student? Like, and to me, that's part of like the gig model of building, like being the organized writer is like applying for grants and fellowships and just like constantly applying for stuff. So do you have kind of a view on that?
Yeah. And I'm very honest always, as you might be able to tell. And what I say to my students is that like if you can do that, that will be enormously helpful for your career. A lot of people that I know who have really good publishing contracts got them through connections that they made at like writers workshops, right? At writers retreats. You know, they could get grants. I do apply for grants frequently, occasionally. But I'm also very honest and say like not everybody has the ability to do that. I've never been to a writer's retreat. I've never had the kind of life or class background that would allow me to do that. I can't take 5 weeks off from my life. It's not economically feasible, but it's also not feasible in my life. I had a special needs kid, right? Like, and there's a lot of people who who can't do that. So, you know, and that's what I say is like, if you can do that, that's awesome. It's really helpful for your career. And also like, you said something, you know, and also just be mindful that not everybody can, and that you're gonna have to make it work if you can't. And you said something earlier about like literary citizenship, and I like what you said, that like it does feel onerous. But I do say to my students, because many of my students, certainly not all, but many of my students are coming in kind of with a leg up. They're going into the publishing world. They've gone to a very good college, and they maybe had advantages already coming in. And so what I do say to them is, you know, if you are able to do those things, absolutely take advantage of it, but do your best to help other people up too.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like don't think that it's just talent and skill that got you there, and you know, extend a hand when you can, lift everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. A question here, just after having a piece accepted by LitMag, what is the etiquette on following up about your piece? I'm guessing if like you don't have information, if they don't say when it's going to be published, or maybe they gave you a date for publication and that date has come and gone, how should writers sort of communicate with editors?
I think if you have questions, you can absolutely just email and ask the question. I mean, I wouldn't email 6 times a day, and I would be mindful of being kind and patient, because again, we're all humans. But yeah, you absolutely follow up on that. If there's something you don't know, like ask that question.
Yeah. Yeah, I absolutely tell people to do the same. And I think there's like this fear of approaching editors. I mean, sometimes obviously we know like writers go overboard, and there are definitely those writers that are too aggressive, you know, they're too eager to communicate with editors. But I think by and large, most writers are terrified. They're terrified if they say the wrong thing, their publication is going to be like retracted, you know, or they're going to like offend the editor. And I'm telling people all the time, like, just send an email, you know,
Just
like
send an email.
they're not going to freak out. They're not going to like put you on a blacklist because you followed up about your short story.
And quite frankly, anybody who is offended by you asking a question about your own work is not somebody you want to publish with. Like, yeah, send an email. Always send an email.
Yeah. So taking like a bigger picture view, it's definitely been a kind of not great time for lit mags. Is this something you talk about with your students? Are you following? Do you think that it's worse than it's been? We've seen, you know, a lot of lit mags have closed like in the past 2 years. I feel like I'm constantly announcing, and big ones too, like Briarcliff Review, Gettysburg Review, like you know, it's I don't actually know. I haven't been following the scene long enough to know if this is abnormal, but it seems certainly at least slightly alarming.
Yeah, I think it absolutely seems alarming. And I don't know either, because I don't have like the statistics, but I actually suspect that it's not that abnormal. It has always been hard for the arts since the beginning of time, and particularly for smaller venues that are dependent on different revenue streams to be funded, or dependent on a lot of volunteer work, you know, in a lot of cases. So yeah, I think it's sad when literary journals close, and it's distressing. I don't particularly think it's anything new. And I do think there's lots of fun, weird, hopeful things going on. Are you a fan of Taco Bell Quarterly?
I know them, yeah.
So, you know, I mean, there's this whole sort of, I think there's a lot more willingness in the literary world to talk about how the stakes are really whatever you set them to be. And that you can just make stuff and just do stuff. And I think there are new venues opening up, and there will be more in the future, I suspect.
Yeah, I think that's true. So one more question, because everything you're saying is so interesting, and it seems like it would be immensely valuable to students. And I get the sense that Emerson is sort of unique because it has this publishing program. And when I talk to other people, they say, oh yeah, we in my MFA program, we never talked about publishing. We never talked about lit mags. And I don't get that. I mean, it seems like we all know lit mags are in trouble. MFA programs, if anywhere, should be really teaching them, incorporating them into the curriculum, subscribing to them, getting their students excited about them. So, you know, why are you one of the few that's like really, you know, teaching this necessary stuff?
So I don't know. I know that even at Emerson, which I think is probably better at that than a lot of other places. Some of my students come in and often say, you're the only teacher I've ever had who's talked to me about any of this. I don't know why more people don't do that. I have some theories. I think, there's a lot of egos involved. There's a lot of competition. I think there's not a lot of people, I think, are willing to do what I do and stand up in front of the students. And the first thing we do is scroll through my submittable and see how many rejections, right? It's like hundreds and hundreds. And then every once in a while, there's like a green acceptance. And they're like, oh, look at you, Professor. Congrats. I'm like, thank you. But I think that you have to talk about this stuff. You have to be willing to be really honest about how it works, what's unfair, what's disappointing, and what your part in it is. And that means admitting both what you don't have control over and also, what choices that you've made, some of which you maybe are really proud of and some of which less so. But I really hope that more people will talk about this stuff. I think there's incredibly exciting things happening in literary journals and in independent presses. And also, that's not to say that you can't want to be published by a Big Five and that there aren't like amazing books still coming out of the Big Five. I know there's some jadedness about that, but like, both and I hope that more and more people will talk about this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
Both because it's fun and because it's fair. It's not fair to not tell people.
Right. Agree. So where can people find you? Like if they want to, I don't know if part of your gig is teaching on weekends or something like that. If people are like, this is awesome and I want to like learn more from this person, how can they do that?
Awesome. Yeah, I don't currently offer any classes like that. But I might in the future. So a couple things. Check out Fractured Lit. I'm a reader for them. They're awesome. I can put in my chat my website. I also, so I'm trans and queer, and I also publish under the name Amy L. Clark. So my website is that. And then you can find me at Aiden Grace Smith on Instagram, where I talk about writing and also lots of other things like swimming. And I'm on Twitter at that's me. Yeah, so those are all ways that you can find me and DM me and chat and yeah.
Well, thank you so much. And I actually totally have a swimming question, but I will take that off the record.
Okay. Awesome.
So thank you so much. This was super, super fun and really helpful. And thank you everyone for showing up today.
Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it.